Hello, my name is Kevin Howard, and I am the host of the new podcast, Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. In this episode, we're going to discuss why we need a Trump whisperer now. Now, I understand this is a conversation and a subject matter that might trigger some of you. So I want to say up front that how we're going to handle this conversation, first and foremost, is this is not going to be about advocating for or against President Trump, his policies, or his public statements. That's not what this is about. The point of this conversation, and it's an important conversation for us to have, is that we need to understand what he is actually doing that is actually impacting our lives. Because the only way we're going to be able to successfully protect ourselves, successfully understand what things that we need to oppose, and maybe, just maybe, what things that we should support, we can't make that decision if we can't separate the noise from the actual truth, the signal of what he's actually doing, so that we can make an assessment as to whether this is something we can get behind or not. So this is what this conversation is going to be about. Okay. And as with each one of our conversations, we start relying primarily on our shared experiences, things that we have both gone together, the narratives that we've been told, what we know about Donald Trump based on a long life in the public as a celebrity, as a business person, and ultimately as president of the United States, right? And our shared humanity, the kind of things that we share that drive us, that help us to relate to each other. So we're going to use those two sources as well springs for validating everything I say. You also are going to be invited by me to verify and do background searches using, I recommend, any version of Chat GPT that you trust, because it has access to all public available information, and it's all sourced, and verify data quickly. Okay. Because I'm going to be going over things that I did the same thing. I did the searches based on all available data just to make sure that we got the story right when we do this analysis. One more bit of administrative guidance before we get into Donald Trump and why we need a Trump whisperer right now is that I'm going to apply the lens of risk analysis in trying to understand who Donald Trump is. I come to you as a person who was a commercial banker for 30 years plus. And for most of my time as a commercial banker, and we're talking about high volume commercial banking, you know, I served in a role as a commercial credit underwriter and a first line approver. And the significance of that is that within a commercial bank, if you're going to decide to lend a business or an individual 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, $80 million, right? You have to do a deep dive into who they are and what is the likelihood that, notwithstanding what challenges come up, they're going to pay you back, right? And so it is a sober lens to assess the risk of investing in someone, so that you can make decisions that don't come back and bite you in the butt. Okay. So I'm going to use that lens to analyze Donald Trump. And here's the thing. It's a lens that you too can verify and benefit from, because the way you do that is you look at how, over the course of a long lifeline, how does he make decisions? How does he deal with stress? How does he deal in different types of settings and environments that tell us who he is, the kind of things that motivate him to make the choices he's going to make, so that you have a sense as to what is he doing, what has he done, what does he intend to do. That is indicative based on his lifelong expression of decisions as a business person, as a celebrity, and as a politician. So that's the lens we're going to use to examine Donald Trump. so that we can answer the question why we need a Trump whisperer now. Okay, where to begin? Who is Donald Trump? Well, yes, most of you first heard of Donald Trump coming into the 2000s, back in the 1990s, but mostly coming into the 2000s when he came on the national scene. Okay. Now, I've had pleasure or displeasure, depending on your point of view, exposure to Donald Trump going back to the 70s. And the reason why is I happen to grow up in New York City, and Donald Trump grew up in New York City. He was from Queens. I was from the Bronx. Okay. These are neighboring boroughs in a city that has five boroughs. So the Bronx and Queens are on the east side, the northeast side of New York City. And so when I was growing up, he was a public figure in New York City that New Yorkers knew. So any of you New Yorkers out there, this will also resonate. This is shared experiences that you will remember the stories that I'm telling. So he first appeared on the scene in the 1970s because he had taken over. He was working with his dad in the commercial real estate business. And they had their bones was doing um, essentially residential real estate, multifamily residential real estate in New York City and the greater New York metropolitan area, right? They did some commercial properties, but primarily it was residential. Okay. So he was learning the business from his dad. He was still in the transitional period where his dad was working with him, right? His dad was his first mentor, not unusual, right? Was teaching him the real estate business, which in New York is a particularly tough business, extremely competitive business, and heavily unionized. We won't get into mob and all those type of things, but all these things affected how real estate was done in New York and how deals were done, in the city of New York, and the Trumps were involved. Okay, so his first claim to fame, sort of in New York, is he ran into some trouble with the Justice Department. And in 1973, the Justice Department brought discrimination charges, redlining charges, racial discrimination charges against Donald Trump and his father for some of their multifamily residential properties in Brooklyn and in Queens, right, in 1973. And they hired a lawyer whose name was Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn. And so he became the lawyer who represented them in this case against them, brought by the Justice Department, which was potentially devastating for them, right? And now, so I should speak a moment about Roy Cohn. He made his bones 20 years earlier during the McCarthy era Red Scare. So this was the period of time post World War II where we had entered into the Cold War. And the powers that be, and I've discussed this in previous episodes, the powers that be in the United States decided that this is not a decision we can leave to the American people as to whether or not we want to be a capitalist country or whether or not we want to be a socialist/communist country, right? No, we have to purge the American people of any association with any pre-World War II association with communism, socialism, or the Soviet Union. Okay, so we had the Red Scare, and we had Senator McCarthy engaged in a destruction of countless Americans who had any pre-World War II association with the Soviet Union or with communism or socialism. And so lives were being destroyed left, right, and center, including the lead scientists who led the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bombs that were used against Japan at the end of World War II. Even he, who should have otherwise been an American hero, right, was destroyed. His clearances stripped from him, prevented from ever working again for the federal government, notwithstanding what he had done, because 10 years before the war, he happened to have the most tangential association with communism, the American Communist Party or something. Not that he was actively involved, but like he had attended a meeting or he got a card from somebody or whatever. It was that trivial. And the pit bull for Senator McCarthy was Roy Cohn. He knew how this was the guy that they used to completely obliterate people. Okay. So this is where he cut his teeth, right? Okay. And so he then went on to get into real estate deals to representing mob figures in the 60s or whatever. Because I said, commercial real estate, residential real estate in the New York metropolitan area, yes, there was some organized crime connections in terms of the construction industry, in terms of the trades, in terms of contracts, state, federal, I mean, state and city contracts, all that. Yeah, there was a lot of, how should we say, gray area, right, involved in those industries. And Roy Cohn had become one of the lead pit bulls defending various types of people engaged in these activities. And so when the Justice Department was bringing charges against them for racial discrimination, and how did the Justice Department build that case? In the silliest way. I mean, it just literally sending white families, Hispanic families, black families to various Trump properties in Brooklyn and in Queens. And lo and behold, when the white family went, there was availability. When can you sign up? Here you go. We got these options going on. And when the black family came in or the Hispanic family came in, all of a sudden things were not the same. Things, well, gee, look, we will put you on the waiting list. No, seriously, we would love to have you, leave your deposit. We'll put you on the waiting list. We'll call you back in 6 months to see if we got something. All right. While, of course, the white family is already moving in, next week. Just letting you know. Okay. So they got caught in cold blood, so to speak, discriminating against people based on race, right? And so they hired a pit bull. And the thing about Ray Cohn is he was very straightforward. Never settle, never surrender, always counterattack, countersue where you could in any way, anyhow. No matter what happens, never admit fault, ever. And above all else, you obliterate your enemies. As I said, Roy Cohn was a pit bull. Yeah, yeah, that guy. Okay. And so basically they countersued the Justice Department. They don't care if it's the government. They went through this process of challenging the motives of the Justice Department, politicizing it, questioning the ethics of lead prosecutors, everything that they can do. And ultimately, this case was settled. And it was settled in a way that the Trumps did not have to admit fault. So they were essentially, it was sealed. We came to an agreement, no harm, no foul. You know, as a person from the city, I'm telling you, not too many blacks got into that building, into those projects after that effect, because again, no fault was found. You know, so Roy Cohn was successful in taking a horrible situation. I mean, he was a fixer. He took a situation where they were caught red-handed, and he got them out of it. Not exonerated, but just enough that they never had to admit guilt. And so they were able to function and go on with their lives. And so this was Trump in the 70s, his first exposure in the 70s. And so for the rest of the 70s and into the 80s, he progressively took over his father's real estate business in New York as he was developing these projects and these properties. And again, this is tough business. And he was doing fine. He was competing. It was, again, tough, hard work. And Roy Cohn was right there with him. And this made Roy Cohn Trump's next mentor, the person who would define certain important characteristics that live with the president to this day. So that's why we bring that up. Okay. But as you get into the 80s, and for people who grew up there in New York, you will recall these things. Trump, as he was gaining some success, and it was a slow slog. He wasn't dominating real estate in New York or anything like that. But he had some success, and his father had built a business, and he was continuing that process, making slow, grinding. He was making money. But he was young. He presented himself as an up and comer. And so he started appearing and curating stories in high society in New York. We had, the celebrity column in New York famously is page 6, and he started becoming a regular, someone who, like an A-lister, but in New York, but coming from he's a successful businessman and young, and and he can speak or whatever. This is what he was starting to do, and he used that to leverage his way into, you know, becoming an A-lister, into actually starting to go on talk shows, local and regional and national talk shows, as he started to go into the 90s. And I mean, he went on Letterman, multiple times. He started going on Oprah. He went, and so he was building momentum because he was shifting his career. Now, I don't know, who knows if it was intentional or not. Again, we're only looking at what we could observe and then inferring from that. But he slowly shifted from doing real estate properties in New York City, in and around New York City, primarily residential multifamily, into diversifying into commercial properties in the 90s, casinos, more complex, hotels, right? But he started shifting his role because he was building a brand. He was building the Trump brand, and he was becoming a media darling, certainly in the New York metropolitan area. But he started successfully going national in the early 90s, to the point where he was featured, if you remember, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous in 1994. Donald Trump was featured as one of those people because he had curated through going on shows like Letterman, going on shows like Oprah, you know, being all over page 6, being an A-lister in the biggest city in the country and stuff like that. He was able to curate a reputation and an image to have his own episode of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous in 1994. So he successfully started to segue away from the grind of commercial real estate, residential multifamily real estate in the New York metropolitan area, with, mob connections and all types of influences that make it a very tough and difficult business, into being the face of luxury, the face of these properties. And he started shifting his participation, not in real estate development per se, but being the namesake, Trump Tower, Trump Casino. So getting naming rights for projects that other people were developing, that, yes, he would use his acumen to make sure that this was something to put his name on, no doubt. But there's a whole different analysis involved between managing the real estate development yourself, what he was doing in the 70s and the 80s, and and picking and choosing other real estate properties that you would associate your brand with. So that they're doing the grunt work, they're having to pitch you as yes, this is a perfect property for your brand. You are the luxury brand, the growing luxury brand, right? We want to be associated with you. We'll pay you a boatload of money. All you got to do is put your name on the thing and market our project. Okay. And he started doing that through the 90s. And so this is how he became the brand of luxury. And he started really accelerating that process. So now, he's doing Letterman. He's going on the Howard Stern show starting in the 2000s. You know, saying again, he developed an ability to be viral before viral was a thing, right? And so he would go on these shows like the Howard Stern show and say these things, and he could get away with it because of the way he did it and who he was. And the fact that he was, by all appearances, rich, successful, presenting himself as a good looking person. I'm not making any judgments one way or the other. I'm just saying that's how he presented himself. That's how he was dressed, right? He always associated and got associated with premium luxury brands, properties, golf courses, hotels, casinos, products. I mean, all types of things. That's what he was building coming into the 2000s. And then he landed The Apprentice on NBC. And this is when he became a truly national celebrity, going through that apprentice period. Okay. That's when most of us found it. Now, along the way, he talked about his politics. He talked about his views on things. And what you could see through the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s is that Donald Trump was pretty much a New York, well, he was a mixed bag, but socially, he was pretty much a New York progressive. He was pro choice and had been for years, right? He knew the Democratic elite. The Clintons went to his wedding. Their pictures, go Google them, right? Okay. He was a darling of Letterman, Oprah, I mean, by the 2010s, he was a regular on Jimmy Fallon. Yeah, that Jimmy Fallon. You would not know. Stephen Colbert. Yes, they were all pals, right? This is not necessarily what was happening over on Fox. This is much more on the Democratic side, much more on the progressive side. Okay? So as he came through that period of time, through the 2000s, built a brand that was further solidified because of The Apprentice and the success of The Apprentice. Right. And this is where it gets a little sketchy. And I tell you, when you do, you often have these gaps when you're doing credit analysis on someone to see, okay, who are they? But given his background in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, there was no known association that I could find with him and, let's say, Rush Limbaugh, who was also based in New York, the EIB, Excellence in Broadcasting. Yes. Oh, it's another story, but I call Rush. When I was in college in the late 80s, another story. But the point is, there was no Trump association with Rush Limbaugh, who was the number one conservative talk show host in America for like 15 years. Okay. Cutting from the 80s across the 90s into the 2000s. Okay. And they were both in New York. So it's not like they didn't know each other, right? But I couldn't find any, this is my man. No, he was over on the progressive side. He was, like I said, he was friends with the Clintons. He was with Oprah. He was, okay. So I should mention his first foray into considering politics, he actually went on Larry King going into the 2000 election to consider running as an independent, right? He actually put together a committee to investigate, the viability of him doing that, running as an independent. And he didn't ultimately do it. But my point is that this is why I say sketchy is that it would appear that the natural fit, given that he was most associating with media sources, media outlets that were more on the Democratic side, that he would have explored. He knew these people, he knew them well. That's all I'm saying. That he certainly would have inquired whether or not, since he was interested in politics, there would be an opportunity for him, right? And yet there is no public evidence that he ever gave it serious consideration. Now, this is where I put my commercial credit hat on. I'm believing that that the Democrats told him no, that the Clintons told him. I have no way of knowing this, but but his brand was critical to him, so he could not be publicly seen making an showing interest in running as a Democrat, for example, and there being no consideration, not him not being taken seriously. So I think that that was a conversation that was discreet before he would put together an organizing committee of any sort. Right, right. And and I think at that level, he got discouraged. They basically told him, no, it's not going to happen. Right. And now we start to see how he functions when someone tells him no. Okay. Because what happened was, so he didn't run independent in 2000. George W. Bush becomes president of the United States, right? His administration turns out to be, I mean, just the Iraq war was a debacle. We got bogged down. The one in Afghanistan was a debacle. We got bogged down. No bin Laden, no weapons of mass destruction, all these things coming to a head. The financial crash coming into 2008. I mean, the George W. administration was becoming a nightmare, and the Republican Party looked like they were a mess. And so here was Obama. Well, the Democrats, most people who went through this at the time, thought that this was going to be Hillary's election in 2008, and it was Obama who lapped her during the primary season. But as I'm suggesting, I really do think Trump felt it should have been him. And the bottom line is it was Hillary's turn. That was the posture of the party coming into the primaries going into 2008. It so happens that Obama was able to build an excellent campaign, and Hillary, is not the best campaigner. He was able to get around her and beat her. But that created in Trump's mind, I think, this notion that why not me? I'm better than him. I got the pedigree. Been a darling longer than him. I got the apprentice. My name is on all these towers and these buildings and properties. I'm the face of luxury. Who is this guy? But he played nice. And Obama got elected. And then he, started demonstrating that he wasn't too happy. And this is when he started moving towards the Republican Party. Now, again, why? Well, certainly the Republican Party was a hot mess after George W. Bush, but also because he wasn't happy. What he was demonstrating, what he was saying publicly, so what he slowly started saying was he was questioning the fact that the Democratic establishment stood firmly with Obama. And so he started down this path of trying to delegitimize Obama by talking about whether or not he was born in America and whether or not he was a legitimate president of the United States, because under the Constitution, you have to be a native born American citizen to be president. You can't be naturalized, right? And so Donald Trump, in a very real way, went after Barack Obama on the issue of birtherism and made it a big, he put his reputation, he leaned into this thing. So again, using my commercial credit lens, to me, that had to do much more with the fact that he thought he should have had this opportunity. He wasn't given the opportunity. This person was given the opportunity, and that crossed him. And he was applying the Roy Cohn method. You obliterate your adversary. And he endeavored to obliterate Obama by doing what? Saying that it wasn't constitutional for him to be president, demanding that he prove that he's an actual citizen, right? And he set about to do it. Now, Obama is a masterful politician. Whether you agree with him on whatever, doesn't matter. I think it's above reproach that he is a masterful politician because he knows how to handle these things, right? And so while Trump was just railing and progressively railing, and the media was, of course, covering all that, Obama kept his powder dry. He's the president of the United States. He's busy trying to do things, like catch and kill Osama bin Laden, right? Okay, so he's doing things. He's making stuff happen. He's not paying attention to what Trump is saying over here. But then, because Trump is making such a stink, Obama says, okay, his people tell him, look, just settle the issue and release your long form birth certificate. And so he did. And did it solve the problem? Did it satisfy Donald Trump? Well, but just a few weeks after Obama capitulates and releases proof that he's an American citizen, is the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And I mean, look, this is what makes Obama a masterful politician. He proceeds to do stand-up comedy. He proceeds to roast Donald Trump with Donald Trump in the crowd, right there in the audience. We were all there. I mean, I wasn't there in the room, but I could tell you I was watching it on C-SPAN. And let me be the first to say, I laughed my off to the point where I was on the ground because here was the president of the United States completely trivializing, trivializing the significance of Donald Trump by saying, by just talking about the kind of issues that he was dealing with, on The Apprentice. So Buffy over here, messed up. He didn't use the right tomato sauce recipe in the new restaurant. And so the critic, it was too much salt in there. And so Buffy had to be fired. Right. Okay. This is the kind of stuff Obama was saying. So the backdrop is I'm the president of the United States and I'm over here in the Situation Room while we are capturing and killing Osama bin Laden. And the person who's criticizing me, talking about I'm not legitimate, is over here with his bones, firing Buffy for getting the tomato paste wrong. Who is serious here and who is just a complete empty suit? That's how it seemed. Just a complete evisceration done in the nicest way. Now let's toast. That was Obama. Okay. So he ended birtherism that night, right? By basically publicly shaming Donald Trump for basically challenging the president of the United States in a context where he was not really doing anything serious. And that's true. So, but once again, we get an idea of how how credit professionals look at these things. How does Donald Trump respond? Oh, Roy Cohn died in 1986. You would think Roy Cohn was right next to Donald Trump in that audience while he was getting eviscerated publicly. Because I could tell you this much, what Donald Trump did is from that evening on, is he knew. he was going to be president of the United States as a Republican, right? So even though he had shown signs that he came up as a New York darling, as a darling of liberal media, of progressive media. As I said, Jimmy Fallon, Leno, Stephen Colbert, Larry King, right? I mean, we're not talking, Fox News here. We're talking, right, the liberal media, the progressive media, the democratic media. Even though he came up through that, his number one character, core value was loyalty. And that if you crossed him, and from his perspective, the Democrats had crossed him, right? In true Roy Cohn fashion, you attack, you obliterate your enemy. So this thing superseded anything. It didn't matter that he was pro choice. He looked over at the Republican Party. They were a party in disarray. And he applied the thing that makes Donald Trump one of the rarest people in US history. And I'm just going to say it straight out. And it's not praise. It's just factually, this is a credit person looking at a credit, looking at an actor, looking at a person. Donald Trump reads the room better than virtually anyone in US history. Full stop. And when I mean read the room, whether you're talking about him standing in front of you and you two are having a conversation, or you're talking about him addressing an audience and he is playing the audience like a fiddle, or you're talking about looking at the entire electorate and saying, what are they concerned about? What are they, what are, how can I reach them? He does that better than anybody. Okay. So don't be hating, right? You look at the record and tell me that's not true. Because what he did was then he read because this now we're coming to the end of Obama's 2 terms, right? And 2015, and what he read in the electorate was that the real divider in the country was not Democrats versus Republicans. The real divider in America was the establishment versus the anti-establishment. No one was talking about that, but he read it. And so what was the establishment? The establishment was the neoliberals, Bill Clinton, Bill and Hillary, Joe Biden, ultimately it would turn out to be Kamala Harris, right? Barack Obama. These were the neoliberals, the Democratic establishment, and the neoconservatives, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Mitt Romney. Okay, right. McConnell. They were the establishment. And they ran the country from 1992 all the way through the second term of Obama. And what Trump recognized, and I say this because of what he did, he formed his entire Republican campaign going into 2016. He defined it as anti-establishment. And how? First and foremost, in the Republican primaries against a field of 19 other nominees and serious candidates. John Kasich from Ohio, who was the budgetary guy during the Clinton administration that helped Bill Clinton balance those budgets and create surpluses and start paying down the debt. That's John Kasich from Ohio. Yeah, he's the absolute legendary, historically significant Republican. Jeb Bush, governor of Florida, who absolutely was the good Bush, was the smart Bush, was the Bush that HW, when he was at Jeb's retirement function, because you have to retire after 2 terms as governor of Florida, actually broke down and cried. And insiders wrote speculative articles basically saying that he cried because it was a fluke of luck that W leapfrogged Jeb to get the shot to run for president in 2000, because the first time Jeb ran for governor in Florida, he lost. And so he had to wait. And then W won the governor of Texas. So by the time you could run in 2000, W had a full term as governor of Texas, while Jeb was in the middle of his first term in Florida. And this allowed W to jump Jeb. But most people who know the Bushes know that the heir to the Bush throne was Jeb. He was the smart one, right? And here was Jeb running in 2016 against Donald Trump. So you had Jeb, you had John Kasich, you had the lovable governor of New Jersey. Was this the Sopranos going on here? But he was lively. Okay, you had serious, established crossover Republicans running against Donald Trump. You know, Meg Whitman and all these other people in 2016. And he was the only one running an anti-establishment campaign. And how did he do that? First and foremost, he did what no Republican would do. He broke Reagan's 11th commandment. He eviscerated George W. Bush, said that the war in Iraq was the worst foreign policy debacle in U.S. history. Yeah, okay. It sounds like that's obvious to you and me now, but go see if you could find in the Google somewhere, in your chat GPT somewhere, right? Any Republican up to 2015, 2016, who admitted that George W. Bush had led us into the worst foreign policy debacle in U.S. history. None of them said that, even though they knew it was true. Okay, so he attacked the Republican establishment, which George W. Bush was the this is the neocons. This is Cheney, right? Okay, he attacked them, and he attacked the Clintons and Obama, right? So he was attacking both establishment sides. This is how a billionaire frames themselves as anti-establishment. And why was he doing that? Because he read the electorate, and the electorate was in a bad way. The economics that the neoliberals established, Bill Clinton, right, and Barack Obama, and that George W. Bush, the neocons, established, was twofold. Globalization on the economic side, and the geopolitics was American hegemony. American hegemony simply means we are the only superpower. So when the Soviet Union, the other superpower during the Cold War, stood down, agreed to stand down in 1991, and here comes Bill Clinton in 1992, many historians at the time thought we are entering the end of history, where this is going to be peace moving forward, because there was no one left to threaten the United States. So we would have peace. What's the problem? Right? The Soviet Union stood down. No, American hegemony says, yeah, we are the new superpower, and we're going to enforce our superpower status around the world by developing bases everywhere and using overt military force, 800 military bases around the world, or covert military force using counterinsurgency, funding, financing, using intelligence agencies, black ops, all types of things to punish, destabilize, and overthrow governments who stood in the way of American domination of the world. That was American hegemony. And that was the neocons and the neoliberals supported this, both sides. And they supported globalization, right? NAFTA, okay? NAFTA was negotiated through the Reagan administration, through the H.W. Bush administration, and ratified and endorsed by Bill Clinton. Okay. And that opened the floodgates. The liberalization of international markets, allowing U.S. multinational corporations to bottom feed the lowest cost markets for labor and for environmental regulations, lowest cost markets where they could produce their goods and then take them from those low cost markets and sell them back into the premium markets like the United States and Europe for a big fat margin. And oh, did it work gangbusters for corporate America. Corporate profits never been higher than than since globalization occurred. Right. Yeah, okay. So, but Trump read the crowd. He read the American electorate. Because the problem with globalization is it was a bad deal for the middle class. It was a bad deal for the working class. And he read that, right? And so he said, okay, I am going to attack, obliterate the establishment, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. Right. And that's how he framed himself as an anti-establishment politician. This is what resonated with an American electorate increasingly betrayed by the establishment on both parties. I have multiple episodes where I go over exactly how the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and the Biden administration absolutely betrayed the people who voted for him. No question. So by the time Trump shows up, when he read the crowd, when he read the electorate, he saw that the demarcation line was anti-establishment versus establishment. And he wasn't the only one who saw that. Well, he wasn't the only one who benefited from that insight, because that's also what fueled Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side. Let's be clear. The only energy in the Democratic Party in the 2016 election, 2020 primary seasons, 2016 primary season was Senator Bernie Sanders, because he was talking about a political revolution. He was anti-establishment. And in the same way that the establishment circled the wagons to oppose Donald Trump, they circled the wagons to oppose Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primaries to make sure he didn't get the nomination for the Democratic Party. But Donald Trump was able to get the nomination in the Republican side. I'm sure there are people mashing teeth in the Republican establishment because they were not as successful as the Democrats were to hamstring Donald Trump and prevent him from getting the nomination. But the electorate, the Republican voters in the primary season, completely obliterated Jeb Bush, completely obliterated everyone who ran against Donald Trump in 2016 primary. Right. Okay. So this is him entering the foray into politics. The demarcation line was the White House correspondent dinner. That broke the bow. That was the final betrayal from the establishment Democrats, where they made him out to be ridiculous, completely eviscerated the significance of anything he had done, made him a laughingstock. And he was going to prove them wrong. So he goes over here, yes, completely abdicates all the political positions he's taken before. And some people say that means that he has no political sense, that he has no integrity. I think this was one of, and again, judgment. I'm not rationalizing. I'm saying we need to understand what is true about him to understand what he's going to do. His priority is loyalty. And if you cross that loyalty, it's complete war. That trumps everything else. And that's what demonstrated his ability to shift and to revel into getting Roe v. Wade overturned, to being a vigorous pro-life person. Right? You would say, how could these two people exist? Well, because there was a more important principle involved that was merely that was secondary to it, and that was he was obliterating the Democrats who had rejected him, who had made fun of him, who had embarrassed him. Okay, so we get into the 2016 election. We all know the results. The Democrats completely they send up the most establishment Democrat in Hillary Clinton. They absolutely check, check the facts, absolutely rigged the primary season to stop Bernie Sanders from defeating her. And I would just tip you off to this one thing that they did. The Clintons made a deal with the DNC that any superdelegate who declared for Hillary before the Iowa caucus and stayed with her all the way through the convention, that they would split the general election campaign funds for their reelection in the fall. And oh, by the way, 95% of all superdelegates declared for Hillary months before the Iowa caucus and stayed with her all the way to the convention. Yeah, this doesn't happen, but it did that year. And this was the critical difference. This is what rendered California, which would have been a big win for Bernie Sanders, it rendered California irrelevant by the time June came along because people were treating as if those superdelegates were already counted and they don't get counted onto the convention. And so it obscured the lead that Hillary had. And the Democratic media, like MSNBC, abdicated their responsibility by reporting the delegates as if those super delegates counted before the primary season were over. Factually, it's not true. Okay. So this is how they rigged the primary to tip it to Hillary Clinton's favor. Okay. But you can't get more dead aired than this. The master of reading the crowd sees that this is an anti-establishment crowd. And the Democrats sent out the most establishment Democrat available. Who could be more establishment than Hillary Clinton? Right? Okay. So she loses. Not going to spend any time debating on why she lost. She lost. They didn't read the field right. But like with most presidents, Trump wasn't ready to lead. I mean, we don't have to speculate as to whether he thought he was going to win. Some people have said he didn't think he was going to win or whatever. But the fact is that, okay, November 4th or whatever it was, November 5th, you get elected, you have tens of thousands of appointments that have to be made. You have a whole government that has to be put together before you raise your hand on January 20th of 2016. So Trump won, as in the first time, his first administration. He had to rely on the neocons. They ran the Republican Party. All the talent and all the leadership was the neocons in the Republican Party, the establishment Republicans. So he defeated the establishment Republicans to get the nomination in the Republican Party. And they were not happy. But they couldn't argue with the fact that he owned the Republican electorate, super majorities of the Republican electorate. And I mean, rising stars within the Republican Party, like Jeff Flake, the senator from Arizona. Yeah, you probably don't remember Jeff Flake. Yeah, he was an absolute rising star, rock star, looks like blonde hair, looks like Robert Redford back in the day, right? I'm telling you. Yeah, he wrote a book obliterating Trump, and he was right. Talking about Trump's lack of ethics, he was right. Trump crushed him in his next election to where he got blown out in his home state in the Republican primary. in Arizona. Oh, the establishment was like, we got you. We understand. Trump is running things. Okay. So Trump comes in as president of the United States, but he has to rely on the neocons. So, they say, well, okay, look, he won. He became the face, but we're running his policy because he doesn't have anybody. And that's what they did. And so when you look at what he was able to do in his first term, it looks pretty much like a neocon, big tax cuts for wealthy people kind of traditional Republican government. Except, of course, Trump is going to put his thumb on the scale. So the things that he could control, priorities that he can control, were targeted, pulling on Roy Cohn, destroy anything that Barack Obama did. So he pulls out of the signature things that Barack Obama did. The Paris Agreement on climate. Yes, the Paris Agreement on climate, the international treaty that we are committing, all the countries of the world that participated in that treaty were committing to holding global warming to within well below 2 degrees Celsius since 1850. That was the goal of the Paris Agreement. And I have a full episode talking about why climate risk is a thing. So I won't get into that now, but that was the Paris Agreement. And we had agreed to participate in it. Well, one of the first things that Trump did was pull us out of it. Screw that. Climate, it's a hoax, right? Complete obliteration. It's not that he actually thinks that. It's that he's destroying anything that Obama did. Okay. Another major thing that Obama did was the Iran nuclear deal. Okay. I mean, so here we go. Iran is on the way to getting a nuclear weapon. And and Iran is a huge country. I mean, Israel would like to destroy them, but they can't. The United States has played around with the idea of trying to destroy Iran. With the magnitude of commitment that would take, we don't have the political will to do that. So Iran is going to get a nuclear weapon in the same way India got a nuclear weapon after Pakistan got a nuclear weapon, their natural enemy. This is how this stuff works. So if Israel secretly has a nuclear weapon and they are arch enemies with Iran, Iran is going to get a nuclear weapon because it's in their national security interest to do so. Why would we think anything less? So Obama says, okay, can we have an agreement where we will, first and foremost, let's apologize for the fact that we overthrew your democratically elected leader, prime minister back in 53, so that the British can steal your oil. Yeah, okay. Yes, we're guilty. We started this fight. And you had reason to be angry at us and take our hostages in the late 70s because we supported the Shah, and the Shah just tortured your people, killed your people for 20 years and stuff like that. And then we protected him on the way out the door. So, okay, we apologize for the fact that you're our enemy because we made you our enemy. So let's make this up. Instead of you getting a nuclear weapon, since you seem to be on the way to doing it, you don't get a nuclear weapon, but we're going to introduce you in, we're going to take the sanctions off and we're going to reintroduce you into the global economy, and you're going to be good and we're going to be good and you're people like us anyway. So come on. Right. So Obama negotiates this deal. By the way, the linchpin in that deal is since the Iranians had the uranium to develop their own nuclear weapons, something that uranium had to be developed by someone so that it can only be used for nuclear power and not a nuclear weapon. So we needed a third party who Iran trusted and who the United States trusted to develop the uranium for Iran to make their Iran nuclear deal work. And who was that? Vladimir Putin and the Russians. Yeah, I just want you to know the number one ally of the United States in nuclear nonproliferation is Russia. Full stop. But okay, so Putin agrees to take the uranium from Iran and prepare it for use in nuclear facilities for power in Iran. And that was the treaty was done. Treaty was accepted in the United States, or accepted in Iran. The International Atomic Energy Commission had inspections to make sure that the Iranians were honoring the agreement, and they were. They were. What does Trump do? Pull out of the agreement. Just pulls out of the agreement because that's Obama's obliterating anything that's Obama. The Affordable Care Act. Okay, Obamacare. Right. He tried everything he could to get that repealed. And if it wasn't for John McCain, he would have been successful. Right? I mean, remember the famous vote? John McCain was, not healthy at the time. Cast that vote, saved the Affordable Care Act. And then Chief Justice Roberts votes with the liberals and upholds the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. I mean, Trump's head exploded. Considered it a betrayal. Good thing Chief Justice is a lifetime appointment. I don't know how he's going to get Roberts back, but okay. So even though the neocons basically ran his administration like, a tax cutting, and let's go over that real quick. There's only two major pieces of legislation. The 2017 tax cut, corporate tax cut, essentially cut corporate taxes by a third. By a third, right? And this is pass-through taxes, S corps, partnerships, and C corps by a third, right? I mean, one of the biggest corporate tax cuts in modern history was that 2017 tax cut. And various tax watchdog organizations did an analysis on who benefited from it. And top earners got like $60,000, $70,000 each in those tax cuts. And the average American got like $600. Go check it out. All right. So it was totally traditional conservative Republican, reduce taxes on the top, you give some crumbs on the bottom for the working person, right? But most of the benefit goes to wealthy. That's what he did in the 2017 tax cut. And then the other piece of legislation was the COVID legislation, the CARES Act. And let me just tell you, I mean, I have another episode where I talk about the CARES Act, but it was a massive boondoggle for the largest corporations in America. Let me just tell you how really quickly. Okay. Because that $2.2 trillion piece of legislation, within there was, I'm just going to talk about two chunks of pieces. There was the funding for the PPP program, which was supposed to be for small businesses, right? And it was like 300 and something billion dollars or whatever for small businesses, okay, exclusively. Then there was $500 billion for the larger corporations, 500 employees or larger. Okay. Of that $500 billion, $75 billion went to the airline industry, designated to the airline industry and the cruise line industry. So you had $425 billion for to share amongst the largest corporations in America as we were shutting down the economy. Okay. Well, the Congress directed, where did these funds go? The PPP funds went to the Small Business Administration, who, working with the commercial banks, issued out the loans. And as long as the proceeds were there, you had funds to issue out. The $425 billion went to the Federal Reserve, right? And what did the Federal Reserve do? The Federal Reserve said, "Oh, okay, we're going to hold this $425 billion, and we're going to make it a loss reserve." You see, I'm a commercial lender. If you lend money, federal regulations mean that you have to have a certain amount that you reserve for your losses, to cover your losses. Now, for most commercial portfolios, default rates are in the 1% range, unless you're getting into crazy lending, right? Okay. Well, the loss reserve that the Federal Reserve did, because we were shutting down the entire economy, April, May, June of 2020, right? Okay, so this was a high risk environment. And, Hilton International occupancy rate was like, single digits, which is close, turn out the lights. It's over. Right? Okay. Well, we have to help these corporations. So the Federal Reserve said, we're going to do a 10% loss reserve. So we're going to hold that $450 billion dollars to cover any losses, but it allows us to lend 10 times that. So they turned around and lent $4 trillion. Dollars. I did not stutter. $4 trillion dollars to these large corporations, right? At what? The federal funds rate and such. I'm not saying it was just the federal funds rate, but let's just start the starting point at 0.25%. Okay. Bottom line is that for 2020, by the end of 2020, okay, the GDP of the US economy contracted 3.5%. Doesn't sound like much, but that's the biggest contraction of the US economy since 1935. And twice the contraction that we experienced in the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. Twice. Why? Because we shut down like up to 80% of the economy for about 4 or 5 months and then progressively opened it up. So that lost productivity during the time that we were sheltering in place is the contraction that the actual real economy experienced. But because the Federal Reserve gave $4 trillion dollars lent at a considerable discount to market rates, $4 trillion dollars to the largest corporations in this country. And oh, by the way, what did they do? Took those monies and repurchased their stock at on the billions and billions and billions and billions. Because how do we know this? Okay. You would think, you would think that stock market performance based on the earnings of these publicly traded companies has some relative correlation to GDP, the actual earnings of the country, the actual productivity of the country, right? And so, to the extent that we did 3.5% less business, less transactions, less economic activity, you would not expect the stock market to grow, would you? Wow. Go check. Just ask your chat GPT. Tell me the 2020 performance of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, of the S&P 500, of the Russell 2000, of the NASDAQ composite. Because let me tell you what they did. The Dow Industrial Average increased about 7.8%. It was over 7%, but not 8%, relative to the fact that the US economy contracted 3.5%. So the Dow went up like 7.5% or so. The S&P 500 went up like 16%. The Russell 2000, now a broader market, went up 18%. And the NASDAQ composite went up 43.6%. Yeah. I mean, this is what $4 trillion dollars can do. And so that we can, you want to see it quantified? You want to see proof that the Federal Reserve did this? Go take a look. Google Federal Reserve balance sheet by month from January 2020 to, let's say, March 2021. And take a look at the difference in the size of the balance sheet on the Federal Reserve between those two times. You're going to see it went up by $4 trillion. Okay, this is my validation proof that you can go verify. Yeah, that money went into the stock market, went into these large corporations who bought their own shares and it blew up the stock market. The stock market performance completely decoupled from the real economy, to the benefit of who? People who own those shares. And oh, by the way, 95% of all shares outstanding are owned by like 4 entities. I'm just saying, go Google and find out who they are. My point is that Trump's first administration was a boondoggle for wealth. Because not necessarily because that's what he wanted to make it. It's because he didn't have he didn't have policy people. He didn't have policy people. He had the neocons because he didn't expect whether he expected to govern or not. He wasn't ready to govern. That's how his first administration went. But he certainly showed who he was because he tried his damnedest to destroy everything Barack Obama had done. Right. And he'd only succeeded by pulling out of the Paris Agreement and pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. Right. All right. So 2020 election, 2020 election comes in, additional shenanigans on the Democratic side. Once again, they kneecap Bernie Sanders. Obama orchestrates, and I cover this in, I believe it's episode 3. How did we get here? And the 4 administrations, yada, yada. Basically, hand the election to Joe Biden. We're going to bring the old man back in. Once again, we're sending the ultimate establishment person. Joe Biden was elected to the Senate in 1972. Think about that. He was elected to the Senate in 1972. You can't get more establishment than that. I guess this would top Hillary as even more establishment. Because I think in 1972, Hillary was what? In high school? So, I mean, hey, you can't make this stuff up. Okay. Biden defeats Trump. Okay. Now, yes, critical analysis, risk analysis. Trump's response to the 2020 election shows incredibly bad character, completely graceless. But again, this is Roy Cohn. This is his mentor. This is, to be defeated by the Democrats who betrayed him. You never ever admit that you're wrong. You never give up. You always counterattack. And that's what he did. Instead of doing like every president who's lost, H.W. Bush, who lost to Clinton, showing some class and grace, Al Gore saying, I'm not going to support any senator standing up and challenging the electors for the 2000 election after the Supreme Court gave the decision to George W. Bush. No, historically, we show a lot of grace and a lot of class in the transfer of power. Trump showed none of that because, again, the Democrats had violated his core rule. They had betrayed him. They had rejected him. They had trivialized him. And him losing to them, he was never going to admit. Okay. And to this day, he still hasn't admitted. True to form. See? Credit people, we just look at what do you do? What's indicative? We're not glorifying one way or another. We just know it's true. Okay, this is what you can expect from him. If you cross him, it's on forever. So, okay. So all types of shenanigans, all types of things he said. And you have January 6th, the day where the Senate is supposed to approve the electors for the Electoral College and make Joe Biden the president of the United States. And you have this protest that goes terribly wrong. Okay. Now, I think, and history is bearing it out, that Joe Biden took the wrong lesson from January 6th. He took the wrong lesson. And that lesson was, it's appropriate to go after the former president, Donald Trump. Okay? Because the Biden administration, now that they did get elected, and in the face of the insurrection on January 6th, right? Oh, we are opening up investigations. We are encouraging Democratic and Democratic leaning attorney generals and district attorneys to open up criminal prosecutions, against a former president. Okay. Now, Donald Trump is not the first president who's engaged in questionable activity, right? We have a long American history of how we deal with that. The most famous, of course, would be Richard Nixon. Okay. Now, yes, So he was involved in the Watergate break-in to try to steal the medical records of a Democratic candidate, and ultimately he got impeached. Well, he didn't get impeached. Well, the House voted to impeach him. He was going to get convicted in the Senate. Republicans came over and said, Mr. President, you need to resign or you're going to get convicted. Okay. So he resigned. Let me just tell you that this offense occurred in Washington, D.C., which even then was a Democratic stronghold. Take note at the fact that Gerald Ford, the follow up president, pardoned him, that the pardon from the President of the United States only affects federal prosecutions, federal violations. There's nothing that stopped the authorities in Washington, D.C. from bringing criminal charges, conspiracy charges against Richard Nixon. No one ever did, because that's not how we treat former presidents. Yes, I understand this naivete about, yes, I understand. We're all George Washington and we can't tell a lie. We have a long history. The reason why we do not criminally prosecute former presidents is that it touches into the area for the court of their weakest authority. And that is the concept of non judiciability, something that's non judicial, something that's not appropriate for the court to decide. One of the primary reasons that something could be not appropriate for the court to decide is because it's something that the political arena should decide. It's something that should be put to a vote. It's something that it is politics, right? And the court should not get involved in politics. And this is the tragic result of Bush v. Gore in 2000, where the court decided that election. We don't have to talk about it at this point, but this is the court historically avoids political controversies because their authority is at its weakest in that space. And so the idea of the other political party in a two-party system prosecuting the previous administration of the different party for acts that they committed while they were in government creates a constitutional crisis, because you cannot differentiate the politics involved with one political party prosecuting the other political party's president from the legal issues that underlie the case. How, it immediately polarizes and politicizes the court. Okay. So when confronted with the Abu Ghraib torture allegations that the Bush administration had committed, there was a lot of pressure on Barack Obama to prosecute the Bush administration for that. And he pointedly and properly refused. And the reason why is he did not want to create the constitutional crisis. Well, unfortunately, Joe Biden rejected that great example and that great advice, rejected the history that did not have us prosecuting Richard Nixon at the state level or at the city level in Washington, D.C., right? Rejected that history and the wisdom of not creating a constitutional crisis, right? And Joe Biden opened up the floodgates to go after Donald J. Trump. And he did. And we all know the result. I mean, we're talking at the end of the day, during the Biden administration, Trump had 4 criminal indictments. And within those indictments, there were between 88 and 92 charges that he was facing. Okay. But all that was done, right, to a person who was still legally able to run for the presidency. And so it's on that basis that Donald Trump ran for the presidency in 2024, in a context where He was a four-time indicted person with facing up to 92 criminal charges. In four different jurisdictions. This is the context that the American public got to say, well, do we still consider him? So then let's take a look at what happened in the Republican primary. Now, the Republican primary was a hotly contested primary. But coming into the primary, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, was heavily supported by establishment Republicans. And the governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, is also a very capable person. Vivek Ramaswamy, right? The businessman, very articulate, young, okay, well-financed billionaire. So there was a vigorous effort to win the Republican nomination. And let me just tell you, he completely destroyed them. I mean, seriously, I think he had like 2,200 delegates, and Nikki Haley had like 90 in second place. That's how completely he destroyed the Republican field. Once again, why? Well, we elected the old man in 2020 to be the adult in the room. And he only reiterated how the establishment had betrayed the American middle class and American working class. Why? How? Well, during the 4 years of the Biden administration, half of which he was running around glorified in Bidenomics and talking about him being the greatest president since FDR, right? Inflation became a thing for the first time since the 90s. Inflation became a thing. Inflation peaked at 9.1% in April 2022. Okay. And the thing is even though it came down to like 3% by the end of the Biden administration, let us not get it twisted. It wasn't 3% less. It was 9.1% and then 5% on top of that one. And then, 4% on top of the 5% and then 3% on top of the 4%. Yeah. The cumulative effect was that, for example, the price of a house had increased 28% from January 2021 to January 2025. The food costs, everything. It was catastrophic for working people and middle class people too. It created an environment where, for the first time in U.S. history, the average middle class family could not afford to buy a home in the average American city. Never happened in U.S. history. This happened under Biden. And what did he do? I mean, what major program did he do to help the people who voted for him in the first place? Yeah, I'm still looking too. I'm just saying. Okay. So what was the mood of the electorate? Yeah. Okay. So Biden, he said he'd only run one term. He broke his promise. He decided to run again. I don't know who was talking to him or whether he was delirious. I don't know. The Democrats cooked the field to make sure that no one could challenge him. They chased Tulsi Gabbard out of the party. They chased RFK Jr. out of the party. And so basically, Biden ran unopposed in the primary, even though there were polling data in 2023, 2024 that said 70% of the Democratic electorate wanted an alternative. That's not to say they wanted someone else, but they wanted to have an alternative to Biden. And yet the Democratic Party could care less. Okay. So they ramrodded this campaign. And I will give you one example so that we understand that this is easily verifiable. In order to rig the early primaries for Joe Biden, they intended to move the South Carolina primary, where the Democrats have those black churches lined up to vote Democratic regardless. We learned that with Hillary in 2016. Okay, well, fine. They were ready to go for Joe Biden, but they wanted it to be first. They wanted it to be ahead of New Hampshire because New Hampshire, how dare you be so independent? You can't be bought. So the Democrats said, okay, if you can't be bought, you are no longer going to be the first in the nation primary, even though you've been that way for generations. No, we're going to move the South Carolina primary up. Small problem occurred though. There was no space between the Iowa caucus and the scheduled New Hampshire primary in order to squeeze South Carolina ahead of New Hampshire. So literally, New Hampshire had to move back. But the Democrats had a problem because the Republicans were in majority in New Hampshire and they had the governor's seat in New Hampshire. So, no, the, the Republican Party was not, even though the establishment Republicans love to hold hands with the establishment Democrats when it serves them, they certainly weren't going to help the establishment Democrats hand the reelection nomination to Joe Biden. So, no, the New Hampshire Republicans refused to move their first in the nation primary that had been that way for generations behind the South Carolina primary. And so, what did the Democratic Party do to New Hampshire when they voted? When those voters voted, they disenfranchised New Hampshire voters. Didn't count. The delegates don't count. The votes don't count. Yeah, this is the Democratic Party. This is how they make sure that their man gets the nomination. Okay, so we don't even know the results. I still don't know the results. I didn't even check because they invalidated them. Yeah, okay. So that's my story as to how the Democrats did that. So Joe Biden wins the nomination. For some reason, someone told Joe Biden that, yeah, let's have an early debate in like June, because everything is decided it's going to be a rematch with him and Donald Trump. And he shows up for the debate and he demonstrates that he's not competent to serve. That's what he demonstrates. It was an absolutely awful, okay. I'm not going to waste any time about the he said, she said, and when, who knew what, when. It doesn't even matter because now the Democrats were in full panic mode because there was no way America was going to elect Joe Biden. Well, I think there was no way they were going to reelect Joe Biden, even if he was fully competent, given the fact that inflation was a thing, that the genocide in Gaza was a thing, that we were mired in $100+ billion in Ukraine, and they were losing. I mean, there was just too many things that there was no way that Joe Biden was going to be reelected anyway. But then you blow out the fact that he's not competent. Okay, we now have a crisis. So they circled the wagons and they said, okay, we have a vice president here. Kamala, it's your turn. You get to be the Democratic nominee. Okay. So while the Democrats, first week in August, are giving the nomination to Kamala Harris, who no one voted for, Donald Trump, once again, reads the electorate. So what does he see in the electorate? Some firsts that hadn't been there. According to the 2024 Gallup poll, and this thing is done like weekly. So this is like over the course of 2024. The lowest number of Americans identified as either a Democrat or a Republican. In both cases, 28% of voters identified as either 28% Democrat, 28% Republican. 43%, tied for the highest in history, identified as an independent. Okay. So Donald Trump sees these trends over the course of the year. He's running his MAGA first usual campaign this is his third time through running the MAGA, right? He's not taking off like a rocket ship. Even though the Democrats are over there imploding, he's not just destroying them because he's lost some of the juice. So he looked at the electorate again and he made a new decision. He said, okay, time to move to the center. Yeah. You're not going to believe that. Radical fascist Trump decided to move to the center in August of 2024. Because in August of 2024, he reached out and cut 3 deals with RFK Jr., with Tulsi Gabbard, and with Elon Musk. Now, this is your opportunity to go into your chat GBT and get s- summarized chronological, biographical position, support, political identification data on those 3 people. You know, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, and Elon Musk. Because what you're going to find is they are lifelong, essentially, centrists who either were solidly Democratic or were Democratic leaning. It's only Elon Musk that is more wishy-washy on that. Right. But definitely centrist. These were all centrists. So I've talked about RFK Jr. in my previous podcast, just a little snippet about the misinformation about how he's perceived as essentially being just an anti-vaxxer. Right? But if you look at the whole body of work, you start to see that he's a centrist Democrat, just like his father was, just like his uncle was, President Kennedy, you know. And Tulsi Gabbard grew up in the Democratic Party in Hawaii. And do some digging on Hawaii Democratic Party politics. This is not the Dixiecrats. This is not the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. Hawaii is pretty progressive. And she's a combat veteran who joined the military in response to 9/11, has only served her country. I mean, this is a woman who I don't think has a traffic ticket. And if you dig into her background, you're going to see as honorable a public servant, dedicated public servant as you can find in politics. You wouldn't know that, but how the Democrats talk about her now. But let me just tell you this. Tulsi Gabbard, in the primaries for the 2020 election, was co-chair of the Democratic National Committee. And she was a rising star. And she ran. And she's the one who eviscerated Kamala Harris at the second Democratic debate and knocked Kamala Harris out before the Iowa caucus. Okay. That Tulsi Gabbard. Okay. Right. Donald Trump cut deals to bring her in, to bring RFK Jr. in, to create the MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again movement, right? And to bring Elon Musk to get to fiscal responsibility, to get some accounting responsibility, to get some auditing responsibility, to get some economic efficiency up in our federal government, which had long, long, long left that behind. Okay. So he cuts those deals with those 3 people. The number one politician amongst independents in 2024 was RFK Jr. Check it out. I mean, just check it out. So Trump understood, okay, you got an electorate, knows it's anti-establishment versus establishment. But he also knows that in terms of identification, it's mostly independent. And that amongst the independents, RFK is the strongest candidate. So therefore, he goes and cuts the deal with RFK Jr. Now, to RFK Jr.'s credit, because he is a Democrat, he tried to he called Kamala Harris's campaign before he agreed to partner with Trump. And he said all of this. Go to YouTube and search for the speech that RFK Jr., the joint campaign announcement in the Glendale Arena in Arizona in the last week of August. I believe it was the last week of August, 2024. RFK Jr. explained how he made the decision to join Donald Trump's campaign, right? And he admits publicly that he called the Harris campaign to see if they would work with him on the issue of nutrition, childhood health, and America's health crisis. Okay. And guess what? The establishment Democrats and Kamala Harris would not talk to him. They gave him no other choice. If you want a seat at the table, you sit with Donald J. Trump because they're not even talking to you. And so he looked hard at Trump and he said, that was the hard choice. After talking to him over a 3-day period, 3 different times, he resolved that Trump was serious, that Trump recognized that we had a healthcare crisis in America, that the fact, if COVID taught us anything, it taught us that the condition of American health was catastrophically bad, that with only 4% of the global population, we had 25% of the COVID deaths because our comorbidities were so bad, right? That we were not healthy enough to fight, to defend ourselves against this disease. Just the bottom line, in the richest country in the world. And so no one was talking about the healthcare crisis in America. This is what RFK has been working on the last 10 years, let alone the environmental record for the last 40 years. Okay. So Donald Trump bought into that. And he said, okay, if you come into my administration, I will put you in charge of Health and Human Services so that you can recalibrate our health regulatory scheme to start getting the right research done in order to align the health of America on a healthy track again. Because we are on a devastatingly disease-laden, cost out of control track right now. Okay. So RFK did it. And they joined the campaign. And so we know what happened. Donald Trump did win. But one of the things that's obscured, and I covered this in episode 1, where are we? And I said, we elected Donald J. Trump. And then I examined who elected Donald J. Trump. It is important, and it's important that I emphasize it here. Who elected Donald J. Trump? Yes, 77.3 million people voted for Trump, and 75 million people voted for Kamala Harris. So over 150 million Americans went to the polls, and there's only 2 million between the two. So you figure, okay, that's not much. That's thin. Okay. That really obscures the fact that all these elections, Biden's election, Trump's original election against Hillary, a lot of these elections are tight. Obama's election against John McCain. I mean, they are historically tight over these series of election cycles. The 2004 election against Kerry wasn't as tight, right? Okay. But that does not, if you go deeper into who voted for Trump, what you notice, and this is something that hasn't happened, in my opinion, since Ronald Reagan's 1984 complete landslide victory against Walter Mondale. I voted for Walter Mondale. Okay. Stop laughing. Okay. But I did, while serving for Reagan in NATO, by the way. Okay. So, yeah. If you look at the demographics below Trump's victory in 2024, you will notice, and I'm saying go into your chat, pull out this data. The voting trends between the 2016 election, the 2020 election, and the 2024 election. Because you have 3 national elections with Donald Trump. And 16, he ran against Hillary. 2020, he ran against Biden. 2024, he ran against Kamala Harris. And you see how America voted. Every major demographic in the United States. Man, woman, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, every age bracket category, 18 to 24, 25 to all the way up 65 and above. Every major demographic in the United States trended towards Donald Trump, with one exception. If you were 65 or older, you voted for Donald Trump 52% in 2020, and you only voted for him 50% in 2024. But other than that one exception, every major demographic in the country voted more for Donald Trump in 2024, despite 4 indictments and up to 92 criminal charges. Yeah, that's never happened. What's more is all 7 battleground states voted for Donald Trump. Obama never did that. Clinton never did that. You got to go back to Reagan to do that. That's what I'm saying. In 84. Okay. So, but what united to have an electorate that diverse, supporting Donald Trump? How did, what was it about them? Well, a well-noted, I think it was the Heritage Foundation, did an analysis, Google it, for the counties that voted for Trump versus the counties that voted for Kamala Harris. And what they found is, and it's been done for 16, 2020, and 2024, but I'm only going to quote 2024. In 2024, the counties that voted for Donald Trump, and he had more voters, let's be clear, only represented 38% of the GDP of the United States. And the counties that voted for Kamala Harris represented 62%. So what's that telling you? The American working class and the middle to lower middle class voted for Trump. And the professional class and wealth voted for Kamala Harris. Okay, this is the disaffected American middle class and American working classes rejecting the establishment candidate. And let's be clear, I don't want to hear any noise about Kamala was not Joe Biden. She had every opportunity to differentiate herself from Joe Biden. And she traveled the country, went on The View, all these places, and she said, what? I can think of nothing that I would do differently than Joe Biden. Okay, then. So you are Joe Biden. And they rejected Joe Biden's policies. And so therefore they rejected Kamala Harris's policies because those were the policies of the establishment. And take note who came out to support Kamala Harris. I mean, was that the Cheneys? The Cheneys supporting Kamala Harris? Was that Mitt Romney? Was that George W. Bush? Yeah, this is the neocons demonstrating that they are just a different side of the same coin, the establishment coin, with the neoliberals. I'm just saying, against an anti-establishment candidate, whether it would have been Bernie Sanders or Donald J. Trump. So this delivers Donald J. Trump into his second administration. And so we get to the bottom line. What is he doing? What can we take? What this life of work tell us about what is he doing? Who is he? How can we predict where he's going? Well, the first thing we can understand about him is that loyalty is first. He will obliterate his enemies. Okay, that's certainly true. The next thing is he reads his customer. He reads the audience. He reads the room better than anyone. And he delivers. He closes the deal. He doesn't just read them just to know them. He reads them to sell them something, to give them something. He makes a deal with them. And he made a deal with the people who elected it. And yes, he honors that deal. And let me give you the proof. Because once he got elected last November, there was nothing requiring him to appoint RFK Jr. to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And certainly there was no one on the Republican side who was advocating for that. But he honored it. And he made sure that the Republicans approved his nomination. Same thing with Tulsi Gabbard. Oh, the establishment, the neocons were pissed off at Tulsi Gabbard in the same way that the neoliberals were pissed off at Tulsi Gabbard. And why? Well, Tulsi Gabbard got crosshairs with the establishment over the decision to overthrow Assad in Syria. Okay. During the Obama administration, Obama made the decision, yeah, let's overthrow Assad. The Russians were involved in this and that. No, we're gonna get in the mix. And we're gonna take this opportunity to overthrow Assad. Here's the catch: one of the factions that were also partnering to try to overthrow Assad was none other than Al Qaeda. And Tulsi Gabbard at the time said, first and foremost, she opposes the use of military force for regime change. Okay. We had done that how many places? She opposes that. That's not a legitimate use of that. Does not demonstrate the national security interests. That's why we're supposed to use our military. Where the national security interests of the country, we are at threat. There's a serious threat to our national security, and therefore diplomacy has failed, and therefore we use our military force to defend ourselves. That's the use of military force, not just to get the government you want so that we can do better business. No, that's what it become. That's yeah. We don't have to digress. So she said, "No, I do not." She spoke out against this, and they treated her like a traitor, as if she was pro Assad. And she said, "I volunteered and still serve in the U.S. military and served in combat in the U.S. military because Al Qaeda killed 3,000 Americans. And you want to tell me the enemy of my enemy is my friend?" Well, maybe in some cases I could stomach that, but not with Al Qaeda. And if you don't think that was what the dispute was about, go to C-SPAN right now, cspan.org, and look up the Senate hearing for Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence and watch the establishment Republicans and the establishment Democrats try to abuse her over the issue of not opposing, of not supporting the Obama administration in his overthrow of Assad. And watch the courage of her conviction when she talks about how she would never ally with Al Qaeda, how she would never dishonor the sacrifice of over 3,000 Americans at the hands of Al Qaeda to take them in as allies in a mission because we hate Assad that much. We hate Assad that much. What has Assad done to us that would be worse than dishonoring the death of 3,000 Americans at the hands of Al Qaeda? Yeah, that's Tulsi Gabbard. And Donald Trump made damn sure that every one of those establishment Republican hypocrites voted for Tulsi Gabbard. So go check out that hearing. Check out how they talked to her contempt, and then go check the votes. This is how Donald Trump honored his word. Again, this is not advocacy. It's fact. I'm a credit guy. I just need to judge. I have to be sober. And you need to be sober too. Why? Because what he is doing is affecting our lives. So we need to understand, what is he actually doing? Not through the lens of hatred or emotionalism or political bias or liberal versus no, just factually, what is he doing? What is he doing? We need to know the truth. And the truth is that he cut a deal with Tulsi Gabbard. He cut a deal with RFK Jr. He cut a deal with Elon Musk. And he followed through. They all had the roles that they agreed to, and they all supported him, and he honored his deal. So the second thing that's important to Donald Trump is when he reads the room and understands his customer and he makes the deal with them that he's going to do what he can to close that deal. Okay. So obliterate your enemy, close the deal on your customer. Okay. So then what is he actually doing? Well, this customer representing 38% of the GDP of the country, they want the jobs back. They want the kind of economy we had before globalization, when the working class could buy a house. Yeah. Globalization, allowing our US based multinational corporations to send the higher paying manufacturing and textile jobs overseas to lower cost markets, leaving American middle class and working class to do retail, to do service industry, to do other positions that didn't pay nearly as well, and failing to train them up to make higher level training easily accessible so that they could transition into something that they can maintain their salaries. No, no, they were left to work where they could. And it has shown. Proof of this is in 2021, the Federal Reserve said, after, and this is after almost 30 years of neoliberal economics, globalization, and neoconservative economics. The Federal Reserve determined in 2021, for the first time in U.S. history, that the top 1% of the country had more wealth and income than the American middle class. Let that sink in. Okay. That's how bad globalization disenfranchised the middle class and the working class in this country. And so what they want the customer for Donald Trump is reverse globalization. Bring the jobs back. And the only way you can bring the jobs back is you have to break the incentive that the US based multinational corporations get from manufacturing production overseas. There's huge margin in being able to go to the low cost market to produce your good and then sell it in the high cost market. Then you get the margin. The only way to affect that margin and convince them to bring that manufacturing and that production back is you tax the import of that good. This is the tariff regime. And so, you know as well as I have, Donald Trump has acted like a lunatic over tariffs all over the place. 50%, 100%, 200%, 300%, 500%, and all over, up and down, in and out. No one knows what the hell is going on. Yeah, he's negotiating with everyone around the world. He's doing all this stuff. Everyone's head is spinning. No one knows what to do. Yeah. Okay. All that white noise over tariffs is Donald Trump establishing to the US based multinational corporations that the globalization game is coming to an end. So get yourself in position to bring the production jobs back here, because we are going to gut your profitability of producing in the low cost market and selling back in the high cost market. Now, we're ending that game. Now, we're 11 months in and we don't see nothing going on but a lot of smoke and mirrors with Donald Trump. That doesn't mean nothing is actually happening, because before Apple and other US-based multinational corporations decide the only way to play the US market is to bring manufacturing back, they got to make sure that those tariffs are real. Because all this is gums flapping. See, they're smart. They understand it doesn't matter what Trump says. It only remembers what he does. And right now, they don't know if these tariffs are going to stick. Okay. So that's the first thing that he's doing. He's trying to reverse globalization through the use of radically high tariffs. Okay. That's real. Okay. The other thing he's doing is he's absolutely dismantling the federal government, the infrastructure of the federal government. Now, stick with me for a second, because he's like, why would his customer want that? Let me be plain. About 98% of the current federal government was hired since Bill Clinton took office in 1992. So the neoliberals and the neoconservatives built this government. Full stop. Okay. So how has the American government served the mass majority of the American people since 1992? Now, I tell you, I challenge you, pick an agency, any agency, identify what portion of the American public that agency serves, and then take a look at the trend line of the American people and ask yourself, are the American people better off since 1992 to today? Department of Education, right? What happened to American education since 1992? Because in the 80s, American public school education was amongst the best in the world. Where is it now? Oh, how about American health? National Institute of Health, Health and Human Services, Food and Drug Administration, right? All this, yeah. What's the condition of American health? We got all these vaccines. I'm 60 years old now. I turned 60 just last week. Okay. When I grew up and I got fully vaccinated, no, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I got fully vaccinated, right? There was only 7 or 8 vaccines. Yeah. What was health like then? It's a heck of a lot better than the 40 plus vaccines we have now. So we got plenty of vaccines. Great. Thank you. And people are making a lot of money. Great thing for big pharma. But how are the people who are getting vaccinated? Are they better off because of the vaccines? Really? What is the state of American health since these vaccines became allowed, became incentivized, since we changed some laws in the 80s? We don't have to talk about that now. My point is, pick an agency, any agency. If you are in the military, think of all the people who served in the military since 1992. I served in the military from 1983 to 1987. And I served in NATO, and I served under Reagan, and I served with Colin Powell in Europe. But just from 1992 to today, how has the Department of Defense served the military? Beyond the general class, the admirals and the generals, who go from military service to being talking heads on all the networks, to working for the military industrial complex, they are doing gangbusters because the military industrial complex is killing it. Yeah, they're doing great. But for the serving men and women, well, after being at combat somewhere in the world for most of the last 30 years, 33 years, the highest suicide rate in U.S. history for our serving men and women. Why? Because of the number of combat missions, none of which involve the national security of the United States. You heard it here. As a U.S. Army veteran, Tulsi Gabbard would be the first to tell you. None of this was because the United States was at risk like we were in World War II. No. All to make money for somebody. How many lives of our serving men and women have we destroyed to make money for somebody, when our national security has not been at risk since the Soviet Union stood down in 1991? So what I'm saying to you here is, yes, part of the deal that Donald Trump is closing is to dismantle that federal government. What is the point of service in the federal government if it's not to serve the American people in the capacity in which you serve? And so if you look at the condition of the American people, particularly, again, since 1992, and you see a persistent trend line that the American people are worse off in every one of these agencies, worse off, okay? Then why are we exactly crying crocodile tears? Because he's dismantling these agencies. They need to go. Now, we need something. We need to serve the American public. But these agencies, these federal employees, were making money and not serving the American people. The American people were not benefiting from their service. The trend line was horrible. You check it out and you tell me, and then put it in the comments. Okay. So that's the second thing he's doing. Dismantling all these federal agencies, hacking, cutting, slashing. Yeah, we shut down the government. He was happy. because that was furloughed fellow employees, people, yeah, sideline. He'll slowly invite some of them back. No. He's going to break the back of the federal government's infrastructure that has disserved the middle class and the working class of this country for 33 years. That's the other thing he's doing. Okay. Again, this is starting to sound like advocacy. It is not. It's simply factual because he's serving. I'm reading this as a credit person. He is serving his customer, the people who elected him. And the people who elected him have been deserved by the government. This federal government, since 1992, has made Ronald Reagan's famous line, and that famous line that he used against Jimmy Carter in 1980 is, the most dangerous words in the human languages, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. Well, since Bill Clinton raised his hand, that's exactly what the federal government is like. I'm from the federal government. I'm here to help. And you should run because we have all been disserviced by that federal government. Okay. So we need a federal government, but we need it to serve the American people. We need it to return to government of the people, for the people, by the people, and not for the benefit of a professional class who could care less about the people they're supposed to be serving. Okay. So what else is he doing? Okay. He is breaking the back of American hegemony. The whole methodology of the United States being the only superpower established by Bill Clinton in the 90s when he decided to expand NATO past Germany, east past Germany, breaking the promise that we gave to Mikhail Gorbachev that we would not expand NATO if they supported the reunification of Germany, if the Soviet Union and therefore Russia supported the reunification of Germany and that a reunified Germany could join NATO, we promised them we would not expand east with Germany. Well, Bill Clinton broke that promise before he left office. So I'm just saying, this is the exercise of American hegemony. We are the superpower and we can do whatever we want. And everyone is going to step in line. And that's just the bottom line. Okay, so Trump is breaking that. Because again, he is obliterating the two major policies of the establishment, the neoconservatives and the neoliberals. Check out the interview with Secretary of State Marco Rubio 1 week into the administration on Megyn Kelly's show, where he says the age of American hegemony is over. That the world is comprised of three superpowers, the United States, China, and Russia. And that amongst the superpowers, we are going to negotiate. Something that we abdicated since the Obama administration, right? Biden would not negotiate with Putin. Trump is negotiating with Putin. Trump is negotiating with Xi. And he is endeavoring to set up spheres of influence again. Except that, unlike the Cold War, where there was two superpowers, there's three. And so, how is he organizing the spheres of influence? Well, they're natural spheres of influence. I mean, essentially, America's sphere of influence is Western Europe and the Western Hemisphere. Russia has Eastern Europe and parts of the Middle East. China has Asia and parts of Africa. And there's gray areas here and there, like India, who's on the new one's particular wing. That's too big a portion itself, right? But they're not quite as well. Okay. And so you will notice within America's zone of influence, the language that Trump uses is there's a new sheriff in town. We're calling this the Gulf of America now. Canada, you prepare to be America's 51st state? Yeah, I know you don't like it. I guess you woke up to find out there's gambling going on in this casino. Ever since the Monroe Doctrine, who do you think was running things? I don't know. But okay. Oh, by the way, Denmark? Yeah, those essential minerals we need in Greenland. Yeah, that's why Greenland is going to be ours. So get used to a new sheriff in town. This is what Trump is doing. This is the sphere of influence. And if we're competing against China in their sphere of influence, and we're competing against Russia in their sphere of influence, we cannot rely on China for our essential natural resources. We cannot rely on China to do all the manufacturing that makes the US economy go like it does right now. This is a part of the pieces of unwinding globalization and bringing manufacturing back within and production back within our spheres of influence, which means that we have to have our own source of critical minerals, right? Okay, this puts Greenland in play. This is what is going on. This is what's happening with Venezuela. We are securing sources of oil. Absolutely. The significance of Venezuela is their oil. It's like the significance of Iraq was their oil, right? Significance of Saudi Arabia is their oil. Well, that's Venezuela, okay? And so we got to have someone in there like we put in the Shah of Iran, who's going to serve American interests and make sure we get that oil cheap. Okay, so if we have to use the drug trade as an excuse, can you see the pragmatism from the geopolitics of what he's doing? Now, with the Venezuela question, this is a great example of the fact that you can never listen to what Trump says. You must watch what he does if you want to understand what he's doing. Okay. If you listen to what he's saying, he's going to war against Venezuela. But let me just be clear. If he goes to war with Venezuela, he will betray his customer. That's something that Trump is not inclined to do. He'll betray a lot of people, a lot of vendors, a lot of bankruptcies and stuff like that. Right. But he is inclined to honor his customer where he can. That's his history. That's what the evidence shows. That's what his practices have been, right? And he got elected by these folks, just like in the same way he honored RFK Jr., in the same way he honored Tulsi Gabbard. When he didn't have to, he got what he wanted. He got elected. He could have told them, hit the road, Jack. I'm never going to be elected again. I don't need to be responsible to anyone. See ya. No, that's not who he is. No, he lies about a lot of things. That's what I said. You can't take what he's saying seriously. You have to set that aside and look at what he's doing. And so what I'm saying to you is if he actually goes to war against Venezuela, then he is betraying his customer. Then you're going to see his coalition start to fall apart. He then becomes Joe Biden. He then becomes Barack Obama, who betrays the people who elected him, right? And I don't think that's going to happen. I think this is why the rhetoric is negotiating posture. The same kind of negotiating posture where he talks about the Palestinians and says, finish them during the campaign, right? But even before he got into office, once he got elected, he made Netanyahu have the first ceasefire, and he's already made him have a second ceasefire, even though the Israelis are, doing what the Israelis tend to do, which is break the ceasefire anyway. But the point is what he's doing is he's trying to end that genocide in Gaza. And so that's what I'm saying about the Venezuela thing too. This is all posture. He just negotiated with Maduro, right? To see if either Maduro will play ball or step aside and let someone else play ball. And he'll rattle the sable and say, we're coming in, we're coming in, we're coming in. He's not coming in. As soon as he comes in, I'll admit that this credit officer did not read him right. But this is just posture. That's why you can't listen to what he's saying. As soon as U.S. forces, ground forces go into Venezuela, as soon as serious aerial assaults, now we're doing, like we're destroying a country. Yeah. Then I will admit I'm dead wrong. But his coalition will splinter because part of the deal is what Tulsi Gabbard is engaged in, is ending these forever wars, ending regime change. This is what she opposed in Syria. So this is not a regime change thing. This is about negotiating access to Venezuela's oil because they're in our zone of influence and we plan on exercising authority in this zone of influence. We're giving up our influence in China's zone of influence. We're giving up our influence in Russia's zone of influence in exchange for them respecting us having domination in our zone of influence. So they will have domination in their zones of influence. And that's how these superpowers will work. That's how it worked during the Cold War. Okay. So therefore, everyone in America's zone of interest needs to understand that the difference between American hegemony and the zone of influence is our tent just got considerably smaller and our focus just got considerably more intense on controlling and making sure we get access to the natural resources we need within our zone of influence. That's what he's doing. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's what he's doing. Okay. And you can see factually how these pieces fit together. So, what comes next? Well, on the tariff side, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to make a decision. Could be just this week. It will certainly be this session. It will be before Christmas. He's using emergency authority to impose tariffs as the president of the United States. Tariffs are a tax. The Constitution gives the authority of taxation to the Congress, right? I believe the U.S. Supreme Court will say, just like they said to Joe Biden when he tried to forgive student loan debt using the COVID emergency authority, right? That you cannot use emergency authority to impose a permanent change. And therefore, if the president wants to be able to impose tariffs that would influence where U.S. multinational corporations can produce their goods, Congress has to pass it as a tax. So I think the Supreme Court is going to invalidate his authority, say it's unconstitutional for him to do this. And negotiations are already ongoing, led by Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut and the senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, right? They already say they have 80 votes in the Senate. And the way they're framing their tariff bill is bone crushing tariffs against any country who buys Russian oil. Okay. I think that Trump is in the process of negotiating with them to say, okay, we will have these bone crushing tariffs, but I need, as president of the United States, the discretionary authority to deploy them to the countries I think should get it. And I think that's the version that will pass. So therefore, he could use it against the Russians if it's advantageous, but he could use it against the Chinese or use it against any foreign country. In other words, use it as the tool to get Apple and other US-based multinational corporations to pull back here. Right. Okay. And so what's going to happen is the Supreme Court is going to rule here in December that he doesn't have the tariff authority as the executive and that Congress needs to give him specific authority. And you're going to see in the first few months of the next session next year, this is not going to the midterms. You will see. They already have teed it up. It will pass the Senate first, and then they will be breaking heads, kneecaps, and holding children in the basement because every one of those Republicans in the House are going to vote for it because I don't think they have a pretty razor-thin thing. And that's how he intends to get his tariff authority. Once that occurs, that's the signal that the major U.S. multinational corporations need to say, okay, the tariffs are real and they can be permanent, and he has the authority to do it. And there's no other protections for this. We need to shift if we intend to make money out of the U.S. market. And so that's a long-term strategy. In other words, even when they realize they have to shift, it's going to take these companies some years and hundreds of billions of dollars and market-wide trillions of dollars to get that manufacturing and that production back within America's zones of influence. It doesn't even have to be necessarily right in the domestic United States, but it primarily will be, right? But the idea is it has to be within the area that we have absolute control in our zone of influence. So with all that in mind, that's what you can expect on a tariff thing. On the geopolitical thing, Russia will defeat Ukraine this spring, full stop. And he's done everything he could to bring that to a negotiated settlement. But because again, he's trying to eviscerate anything that Biden, anything that Biden has done. Because Biden went after him. Biden was instrumental in him having 4 indictments and charged with up to 92 crimes. I mean, charges. Oh my God. So anything Biden is doing, big beautiful bill, totally destroyed, defunded the Inflation Reduction Act. Biden's signature climate bill is going to be stuck in litigation. Everyone is going to be bankrupt by the time it gets through the courts. The courts will say that he can't retroactively do that, in terms of the commitments that were made. But by the time those decisions are made, most of those companies will be out of business. So he's eviscerating the Inflation Reduction Act. And I say this as a climate consultant, right? Who's had to redo my entire business model because of what Trump did. But he's destroying anything Biden did because of what Biden did going after him. Okay, so that's out. War in Ukraine. He's basically dismantling NATO, right? He's basically punishing the Europeans. They're all losing their political clout. They're losing in their domestic markets in the same way Biden was going to do in the United States. Check it out. See what's happening to Macron. See what's happening to Keir Starmer. See what's happening to the chancellor in Germany. I mean, they're all extremely unpopular on the way to losing, even if they just came into office. I mean, it's catastrophic failures in those kind of countries for the political elites who are still towing the line that Biden was towing, the establishment line, American hegemony and globalization. So, yeah, the war in Ukraine will end with an absolute Russian victory. Our $125 billion down the drain, that's just going to happen in the spring. Lock that up. Israel's going to lose in the International Court of Justice. They're going to be convicted of genocide. And there's going to be catastrophic political fallout. Now, for all types of legalistic reasons, because the United States has filed objections to the application of the International Court of Justice to the United States, even though we have ratified the Genocide Convention, right? We have filed an objection to their prosecutorial authority. So it's very difficult for the International Court of Justice, for any one of the other ratifying nations to bring charges against the United States or the former administration, the Biden administration, for complicity to commit genocide. But there's going to be political fallout on that issue, believe me, because Israel will be convicted for sure of genocide in Gaza. And the Netanyahu administration and senior officials in that administration will be guilty of genocide. And someone is going to prosecute them, and that won't end well. And so people will be calling for accountability for the Biden administration because they were the government who made that happen, right? And whatever Trump is doing to end this will be his defense that he wasn't in charge and this is what he tried to do to end it. He's the one who did the ceasefires, even though he protected Israel in the UN, just like Biden did. So that fallout is going to occur next year. Right? What other things can we expect next? RFK Jr. over at Health and Human Services. The flutter of activities he's engaging in is that so many of the questions that people who've been branded conspiracy theorists and all types of folks, anti-vaxxers or whatever, one of the fundamental issues is that the scientific research to address the questions that people have asked have not been done. Because the scientific research hadn't been done on the connection between autism and vaccines and all these other things, right? There needs to be scientific research to answer the question. Everything else is anecdotal. Because it's anecdotal, people get dismissed as conspiracy theorists. Well, what RFK Jr. is doing is they're doing scientific research. And we're going to start getting answers to many questions that the establishment did not want answered because they were too busy making money on our lack of wellness. They were too busy making money selling us drugs. They're too busy making money selling us vaccines to address things that they were causing in the first place. And so when the scientific evidence comes in on the actual correlation between some of these things, the anecdotal evidence supports now, but we don't have scientific evidence to prove. All of a sudden, you're going to see a series of new policies from the HHS for these things. And so that's something you can start seeing over the next few years. Profound changes to nutritional guidance, profound changes to drug approvals, profound guidance to the application and the required use of vaccines. All these things you can expect to become, but it's going to be driven by scientific research. The idea that we're just going to use anecdotal evidence. No, this is what RFK Jr. has been doing, is getting studies started. And so that we can get the proper answer, the proper scientific, not-for-profit research done to establish the cause so that we can start healing America. We can start improving American health. Because again, it's not advocacy. American health is the worst it's been. Full stop. There's not been a period of time in U.S. history that American health has been this bad. And we need to do something about it. Our children are as sick as they've ever been. We need to do something about it. And then you're going to have the midterms. And I think we have indication. I think we have strong indication that it's going to be mixed results for the midterms. And why? One, because most of the benefit of reversing globalization, even if Trump gets his tariffs through the Congress and the process of moving manufacturing and production back into the United States starts, the benefit of that is years away. So you're dealing with the fact that costs are going to go up as these companies are in transition and tariffs are being imposed on imported goods. So the pain is now. And even though the working class and the middle class have pretty much come to the conclusion that they have nothing left to lose, if the price that they're paying now is the transition and they can see evidence of the transition, I think they're hold. But some people will leave because they're suffering and they're desperate. And someone is going to promise them something. So I think it's not that the Republicans are going to be stronger. I think they're going to be weaker because in the midterms, because things are not going to be good. We're going to be going through massive change, and the benefits of that massive change won't be seen yet. Okay. Problem is, the Democrats got nothing. I mean, where's the energy in the Democratic Party? I tell you, it's in three mayors. Michelle Wu in Boston. She's been first because she's been there since 2021. And she ran unopposed in Boston. Mandami in New York, who was opposed by every establishment person you could think of. And he crushed them in New York. And Katie Wilson in Seattle. Okay. Now, if you do any background on all three of those people, and please do, ask your chat for a chronological summary of the political positions of those three people: Mondami, Katie Wilson, Michelle Wu. And you see, these are anti-establishment Democrats. Okay. They're anti-establishment. They're not establishment Democrats. Okay. They are talking about big time changes on behalf of working people. Full stop. The Democratic Party of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden was the Wall Street, professional class, extreme wealth Democratic Party, right? You will not see any policies advocated by those three mayors that meet that profile. They are anti-establishment, pro-working class people, pro-socialism if necessary, pro-public support and subsidy, pervasive, right now type politicians, okay? This is a new day. And the only energy, the only hope for the Democratic Party in the midterms is candidates like that. For the rest of them, who are still trying to do the neoliberal thing, who's still trying to talk out of both sides of their face, the electorate has already left. No one believes you anymore. So the midterms are going to be a mixed bag because the Democrats have not figured out yet that the electorate is anti-establishment. And if they want to be taken seriously at a regional and national level, they need to get on board. Maybe by the time you have the open election of 2028. Okay. So that is that. The Republicans might lose the House of Representatives because it's so razor thin. Hard to say. But that would be because enough anti-establishment Democrats got elected. Right. But they're not going to necessarily join forces with the Republicans. No. So, so all I'm saying here is if Trump wasn't a lame duck because he can't run again, supposedly, he will be an absolute lame duck if he loses the House. And so what does that leave his last 2 years? It's payback time. And he got nothing to lose. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like political fallout associating with Israel being convicted of genocide. You are going to have isolation of Israel. And you're going to have a tremendous amount of pressure on the United States to also separate or risk splitting the world and isolating against the United States. Right. And you have a president who can't be reelected, who still has payback. So what does that mean? You might see Joe Biden be brought up for prosecution for complicity to genocide. Because here's the irony. In 1988, the United States ratified the Genocide Convention. And in order to ratify the Genocide Convention, Senator Joe Biden wrote and led the passage of the federal enabling legislation codifying the Genocide Convention into federal law. Okay. So he absolutely can be held accountable for complicity to genocide if Israel is guilty of genocide. Now, Donald Trump has nothing to lose and no one to answer to. So, if the president of the United States, in a lame duck 2 years, decides that he wants to give the world something, cut a deal with the world, I will prosecute Joe Biden or representatives of his administration in case Joe Biden dies, or even do it in his death. Yeah, that's the circus we're talking about because he will have 2 years to do whatever he wants to do, right? Here we go. That one I see in short hairs because that's something that can be done. And he will have a strong legal basis to hold the Biden administration and President Biden in particular guilty of that. And it will be a part of his own defense that he'd be willing to do so. Just letting you know. And that's it. This is what he is doing. So what's the breadcrumbs in all of this? In order to find the signal in all the noise that Donald Trump gives off, it's important, it's imperative that you ignore what he says and you focus your energy and your attention where he focuses his time in what he's doing. This is where the magician's trick is done. That's the first thing. The second thing is remember who his customer is and how that his customer is really important. That what makes Donald Trump is he can read the room. And he read the American electorate correctly. that the American electorate is split between the middle class and the working classes on one side, who have been betrayed by the establishment, and the professional class and the wealth on the other side. And that when you are judging Donald Trump and what he's doing, never forget that he got elected by the disenfranchised American middle class and American working class. And that whatever contempt you feel for Donald Trump, and I share a lot of that, I hope you don't share that contempt for the people who got betrayed over the last 32 years because of neoliberal and neoconservative economics, globalization, and geopolitics, American hegemony. Okay. And then the third thing, I'm all for resistance. The breadcrumb that I hope this analysis has provided is that it's imperative that you deploy your resistance not on everything that Trump does, but you deploy your resistance to the policies that don't make sense, right? To the policies that really hurt America, that you find, if there are any policies that are going to help the working class and the middle class of this country, right? That you don't resist those just because Donald Trump is doing them. Whatever you got to do to rationalize, yeah, broken clock is right twice a day, right? Whatever you have to do to rationalize, look past Donald Trump and look to what he's doing and ask yourself, who would that benefit if that was done? If we can reverse globalization and bring these jobs back to America, even though it won't be as many jobs as they were in the 80s, it would be better than what we have here in the United States now, which is a mixture of service jobs, none of which can allow the working class to afford a home, to save for retirement, to send their children to school. 2/3 of the country can no longer afford the American dream. The third breadcrumb is just to target your resistance to policies that actually hurt people at large, and to the extent that you can find policies that would be helpful to the broad, disenfranchised middle class and working class, that you don't resist those just because it's Donald Trump. And there you have it. Well, that was quite the journey. I hope you've stuck through it. I hope I achieved my goal, which is to demonstrate that this was a risk analysis of Donald Trump based on the publicly verified decisions that he's made, how he's responded to various forms of stress, so that we can understand what his priorities are that drive the choices that he's making right now, and that we have a toolkit for assessing what is true about Donald Trump, about what he's doing that actually impacts our lives. Because then on that basis, we will know what we can do for ourselves and our children and the rest of the country. So I thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to your many comments and notes. And I will see you next time in the conversation. You take care.